So we had a whole discussion about B'chor, and now we get back to, we're still dealing with animals on Yontiv, and we get back to maybe straightforward muksa questions. Behema shemesa lo yizizenim koma. If an animal dies on Yontiv, you can't move it because it's a muksa, it has no use. Now, of course, the question is, what about the use of dog food? We'll get to. Umaisa v'sholos Rabbi Tarfon aleha. They asked Rabbi Tarfon about it. What about this animal that died? Can we do something with it on Yontiv? V'al hachala shenitmea, and chala, which means chala that was separated from the dough to be given to a kohen, and it was truma, and it became tamei, and therefore the only thing you can do with truma that is tmeah, chala has the status of truma, is you can burn it. And interesting, Rabbi Tarfon went into the study hall and he asked their opinion. The Amrulo, and they said to him, Lo yazizamim kamam, you cannot move it from its place. Quite fascinating in the Mishnah, this idea of going and soliciting the opinion of the anonymous base medrash. Rabbi Tarfon normally used to as one of the major authorities. But anyway, that was the conclusion. So we have the halacha that chala, that becomes tamei, and an animal that dies is muktzah on yantav. Let's take a look. Lema tnan stama delok Rabbi Shimon. Let's say our Mishnah, the anonymous Mishnah, is going not like Rabbi Shimon. The Tanya we turn the Beitzah. Rabbi Shimon Omer mechatchinas hadluim lifnei behema v'esanavelu lifnei klavim. That if you can chop up a gourd in front of an animal, now that's not a muktzah issue, but that's an issue that the gourd was not edible raw, and you can chop it up and make it sort of edible, and that's not considered to be a tircha, or it's not considered to be another problem. Anyway, the gourd is not our concern. The concern is an avela, an animal that died on Shabbos. The context here is Shabbos, but you can chop it up and make it into dog food. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imoy son of Erev Shabbos, Asura. No, if it hadn't died on Erev Shabbos, it's Asur. If it died on Erev Shabbos, and maybe you could say when Shabbos began, it was considered, thank you, like you already had planned for it to be some type of a dog food. But if it died on Shabbos, then no, then it is a problem of muktzah. When Shabbos began, that was not its intended use. Particularly also on Shabbos, if you have an animal when Shabbos begins, you're not even planning on using it for yourself, right? That's the difference between Shabbos and Yontiv. Anyway, you see here that Rabbi Shimon says that an animal that dies on Shabbos isn't a problem. Presumably, Kal V'chomer, it's not a problem if it died on Yontiv, when you could have had the potential of shechting the animal before it died. So the Gemara says, no, I feel the Rabbi Shimon. Maybe Rabbi Shimon agrees in our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon agrees that if a live animal dies, it's forbidden. Now that's like, what? That was exactly the point. The animal died, and it says, the Beitzah says, according to Rabbi Shimon, you can chop it up for dog food. So Rashi says, basing himself later on the Gemara, that Rabbi Shimon's position that you can chop it up for dog food would be a case where the animal was like on its last limbs, on its last legs. It was it was old and sickly, and it was about to die. That's what he's right. So, and the difference is and maybe it's a subtle difference in the language. Our Mishnah says behema shemesa. It sounds like it was like a unexpected thing. You had this wonderful, live, healthy animal, and it dropped dead. Whereas in the Beitzah, where Rabbi Shimon says it's not a problem, it says es hanevela lifnei haklavim. Like, it starts with seeing it as an avela, like something that maybe was expected to have become a carcass, expected to die. So anyway, it's funny because the basic distinction is hidden in the Gemara. But the basic answer is that in our Mishnah, it was an unexpected death. And when he allows you to chop up an animal that died into dog food, that's an animal you were expecting to die, that was on its last limbs. Let's keep on going, and we'll see how this develops. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. Hanicha the Marbar Amemar Mishmei de Rava. That's good according to Marbar Amemar in the name of Rava. The Amar Modahaya Rabbi Shimon Valichaim Shemesu Shasurim. Rabbi Shimon would agree that if it was a healthy animal that dropped dead, it would be forbidden. That would be muktzah. Shapir, that works well. Elamar Braid Rav Yosef Mishmei de Rava. But according to Mar Braid Rav Yosef in the name of Rava, the Amar Chalakaya Rabbi Shimon Afilu Valichaim Shemesu Shemutarim. When Rabbi Shimon says you can chop up the animal for dog food, the carcass, he would say even if it had been a healthy animal that dropped dead, not only if it was an animal that was like on its last limbs. So Michael and Ema. So according to that, the Rabbi Shimon allows all cases and says it's not muktzah. How do you explain how the Mishnah says that it is muktzah, unless the Mishnah is not Rabbi Shimon? So the Gemara says, Targemu. So, I don't know why it'd be so terrible to say it's not Rabbi Shimon, but is it possible to still say the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon? So the Gemara says, Targemu Ziri b'vehemas kachim. Yes, maybe the Mishnah is even Rabbi Shimon, and when it's talking about an animal that died, that it's muktzah, it's not talking about a normal animal. Maybe Rabbi Shimon would say you can use that for dog food. It's not muktzah. We're talking about an animal that had been sanctified. that was a korban. And in that case, then it is muktzah, then you can't use it as dog food, okay? Because it's kachim, and kachim has. So Rashi gives two reasons why you cannot use it for dog food. Now, because Rashi says, what about the fact about redeeming it? Why can't you redeem it on money and then chop it up? So Rashi says two explanations. One answer is that you can't redeem an animal once it's dead. An animal needs to be alive to be redeemed. Okay, there's a debate about that, whether once an animal has died. And the other halacha is even if you could redeem an animal once it's dead, the principle is ein podim misakadshim lahachilim leklavim. You can't redeem an animal that had died just in order to use it to feed it to the dogs. That's obviously not respectful for kudshim, that the kedusha is being removed so that this can now be fed to the dogs. So therefore, what you would do it is you have to burn it. So maybe the Mishnah, when it says that it's muktzah, is talking about a special case of kudshim, and that's why it's muktzah. Then, of course, that you would have to, bury it or burn it. Yes. So the Gemara says like this. Rashi said you're correct. Actually, it would be bury it in this case because it wouldn't be psula. It wouldn't be psula b'kodesh. It would become invalid even before it sort of got in the context of the mikdash. So it would be buried. So the Gemara says like this. So that would be its special case. So the Gemara says, Dikanami, that actually can be inferred from the language of the Mishnah, Diktani aleha, ve'alachala shenit me'ais. And also the case of challah that became tameh, that you would not be, that it was muktzah. My challah, so the same way, what's the story by challah? The kedisha, it's sanctified. Abema the kedisha, so presumably we're talking about two related cases. So the animal also that died is an animal that was sanctified, and that's why it's muktzah. So the Mishnah could be Rabbi Shimon, and even the dead animal is muktzah because it's a case of kudshim. So the Gemara says, Elatayim de kedisha. So you're telling me the reason that the animal's a problem is because it's sanctified. Hadachulin shaya. So if it was not sanctified, it would be permissible. So now we're going to sort of ask the same question in reverse. So according to the one that says Reb Shimon would allow even a healthy animal that dropped dead, and say that it's not muktzah, that makes sense. Then now you're telling me the only case in the Mishnah that it's a problem is a sanctified animal. Shapir, that works. Elamar bara meimar mishmei derava damar modai Rabbi Shimon v'alechem shebesu shasurim. But according to the approach that Rabbi Shimon would say that if it was a healthy animal that dropped dead, it would be forbidden. So why would the Mishnah only be talking about kudshim? Rabbi Shimon shouldn't disallow even a normal healthy animal that dropped dead. So Michael meimar. So Gemara says, fine. So if you want to say it's kudshim, right? I can tell you it still works according to the one that says Rabbi Shimon would disallow a healthy animal that dropped dead. So why, therefore, is the Mishnah limited to a case of kudshim? Because the Mishnah would be talking about a not healthy animal, an animal that's endangered, that's about to, that's sickly and that's about to drop dead. And therefore, the only reason in that case Rabbi Shimon would say it's a problem is if it was a case of kudshim. Okay, so that was quite, complicated, really, just to try to discuss whether the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon or not. But basically, it boils down to the fact that the Mishnah says an animal that drops dead is muktzah. Is it Rabbi Shimon or not? We know Rabbi Shimon in general says that you can chop up an animal, an avela, an animal that became an avela on Shabbos. It's not muktzah. So is this Rabbi Shimon? So one simple answer is it isn't Rabbi Shimon. Okay, but if you wanted to say it's Rabbi Shimon, how would you make it work? So one possibility is a distinction between a healthy animal and a sickly animal. And the Mishnah that says it's muktzah is healthy, and Rabbi Shimon that said that it's not muktzah was when you were expecting it to die. It was sickly. Another explanation is that they're both cases of healthy animals, and Rabbi Shimon would even allow a normal healthy animal that dropped dead. But our Mishnah is a special case of kudshim, and because it's kudshim, that's why it remains a problem even after it dropped dead, even though a normal healthy animal that dropped dead, Rabbi Shimon would say is not a problem. If you want to insist that the Mishnah is kudshim, and say that Rabbi Shimon would nevertheless normally allow a case, not allow a case of a healthy animal, why would the Mishnah be talking only about kudshim? So that's the last answer of the Gemara. If it was kudshim, even if it was sickly, and a sickly case, Rabbi Shimon would normally allow, but if it was kudshim and sickly, it wouldn't allow. So basically, Rabbi Shimon wouldn't allow certainly a case of kudshim, because then there's no use for it once it's dead. And the debate is, would he allow a case of a healthy animal that dropped dead when you weren't expecting it to die? When Rabbi Shimon says that there's not a muktzah problem by an animal that dropped dead, would it even be a case of a healthy animal? And that's what is debated. Yes.
So can you not move a chal shnit made for fuel?
So that's a good question. So interestingly, Tosfos, right? So that was like, admittedly, not so interesting. Meaning, could the Mishnah be Rabbi Shimon? I mean, what it basically does is it points out that Rabbi Shimon might distinguish between a healthy animal and a sickly animal. But even the case of a kachim is quite obvious. If the halacha is you can't do anything with it, you can't redeem it, you have to bury it, then it's a pretty self-evident case that the kachim case would be a problem. The real more interesting case, which the Gemara completely ignored, which Michael is mentioning, which Tosfos focuses on, is the challah. Because what do you do with tamei challah? You burn it. But if you burn it, the halacha is you're allowed to get benefit from it when you burn it. So why is challah considered muktzah? Why don't you burn it and use it as, to cook your food over? Why don't you use it for your fire? So Tosfos has a long discussion about that, and his basic answer is, he has more than one answer, but I'll give you the simplest answer is, he compares it to the case of not bringing shalomim on Yontiv, right? Even though you're going to eat from the food. Because if you remember, the Gemara said, why don't you bring shlomim if they're not obligated to be brought today? Because fundamentally they're brought as a korban, and only secondarily do you eat from it. So the fundamental act of slaughtering it and burning it is an act of, slaughtering it, let's say, is an act of bringing it as a korban, not an act of ochel nefesh. So Tosfos says the same thing would be true here. Fundamentally, the act of burning it would be doing the mitzvah of burning, truma that became tamei or challah that became tramei, and the halacha only is that incidentally in the process of destroying the truma and the challah, you're allowed to benefit from it. But that's only a secondary and incidental thing that's allowed, and the fundamental act is not done with tzarach ochel nefesh. So that's Tosfos' answer.
By the way, I was wondering...
Which is a much more interesting question than what the Gemara is focusing on.
I was wondering why you could chop up in the Vela in the first place for dogs, where it's not ochel nefesh, was it simchas yom tov?
No, but you're not doing a malacha. You're right. The question is lachem below leklavim, although the below leklavim was debated. Leklavim was debated, but it's not. All it is tircha. It's not a malacha. So the Chazal allowed a lot of tircha cases for your animals. Not every case, but a lot. Okay, so now let's look at the next Mishnah. Now, the next couple of Mishnayos get into interesting cases of what they did allow for eating, and even getting close to certain types of transactionary actions, like getting to the store and getting some food, if you didn't prepare enough food for Yontiv, without actually technically engaging in buying and selling, but things that are close to that they gave you latitude for the sake of Yontiv. So let's take a look. So you cannot appoint yourself on an animal, like go into an animal, like count, get on a list of who's going to eat the animal at the outset on Yontiv. But you can sort of all join together for it before Yontiv. And you can shecht it and divide among them. So what exactly is going on here? So let's see what the Gemara says. What does this mean? You can't all count together for an animal on Yontiv. You cannot basically say, okay, we've got an animal here, we're going to divide it amongst ourselves. Everybody has to chip in, it costs $1,000. So how much are you going to chip in? Michael, you're going to pay $50. You get a 20th of the animal. Somebody else is going to pay $100. We'll give them a 10th of the animal. You can't do that on Yontif. That's talking about money and dividing something according to how much people are paying. Even if no money changes hands, that's a type of, mekach umemkar. That's a type of commerce on Yontif. That much we won't allow to explicitly discuss the money issue. So so what can you do? So Amarav maybe shtei behemot umamidim zu etzel zu va'omer zu kazu. So let's say before we get to dividing the animal, let's say you want to go to the butcher who actually, or whatever, the guy who has the and you want to get some meat on Yontif, but you can't talk about how much money you're going to pay him afterwards, right? So but obviously you'll pay him after Yontif, but you can't explicitly talk about how much money. So what he's going to do is he'll take two animals and he'll say, look, here, these two animals, right? They look about exactly the same health and weight and size. You take this one, and after Yontif, we'll talk about it. And then what you do after Yontif is you take the one that's still alive and you figure out how much that one is worth, because we all agree that these two are roughly equivalent. Okay, so that, number one, allows you to get the animal from the person selling the animals, or if it's chopped up meat already. Look, these two steaks look roughly equal, right? You take this steak, and after Yontif, we'll talk about it, and then you figure out how much the remainder steak would have cost. So that's how you get basically the ownership of it. You're allowed to take possession of it as long as you don't talk about money. Okay, so that's what you can do on Yontif.
So a butcher was basically a guy with animals in his backyard.
Yeah. Okay.
With a knife.
Exactly.
It's not
Okay.
halacha.
Now that's in terms of getting the animal. How about in terms of dividing it amongst the group? So let's take a look at the next stage. Tanya Nami Hachi, we taught similarly. Lo yomar adam l'chaver hareini imcha b'sela hareini imcha b'shtayim. Don't say to your friend, look, I'll chip in $1, $10 for that animal. We all went. Somebody went to the butcher, got this big animal. Now we have to divide it. Who's going to eat 1,000 pounds of meat? So say, okay, I'll give $20. I'll give 30. You can't say that on Yantiv. So what are you going to say? I'll take a quarter of the animal. I'll take a tenth of the animal. And then after Yantiv, you go back. So you're not talking about money, right? You're talking about what proportion, right? What percentage of the meat you're going to have. And then after Yantiv, you'll figure out how much money does that translate into. So they allowed you a lot of latitude and even allowed you to take possession of it. And there's obviously understood that it's going to be paid for as long as you don't talk about money. So that's quite shocking. I think most people are not aware about how much latitude Chazal gave you, and we're going to continue to see this, about taking possession and basically purchasing things as long as you don't explicitly purchase them. But once you realize that the Torah allows you to shecht and to cook and to do all these things of meleches ochel nefesh, this is part of ochel nefesh, is getting possession of the actual food. I even pointed out when we discussed about the whole latitude of carrying, right? Why is it that carrying of all things is permissible, and why is it that that's sort of defined as, that's related to ochel nefesh? How is carrying related to ochel nefesh? And we tend to forget that the first part about preparing your food is going to the store and getting the food. And that's why that is like, a central aspect. The commerce, conveyance, that's what carrying is all about. It's conveyance of goods, shipping, essentially. So that's why this is actually something that Chazal gave a lot of latitude to. Yes?
Yeah, I was just saying. One is that, if it's a problem talking about money, then, how do you do with all these appeals and whatever it is? As you say, Chatzei Shamayim are different.
Right, that's basically Chatzei Shamayim, and you're actually, correct, and you're not actually engaging in a transaction there. You're sort of talking about how much you'll give in the future. You're not getting something for it.
And the other issue is, there's this tension between, like, something looks like an Uva Dechol, which it certainly does.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, they couldn't even say, you can't do that. It's too close to being Uva Dechol.
Yeah, I know. That's a very funny. Uvda Dechol, there's something, and we'll actually get to Uvda Dechol in a minute, but the fact about what things are forbidden in Uvda Dechol, and it was very troubling, right, when we saw 2 days ago, the whole person about the blind person and the stick, and that's Uvda Dechol, and this is allowed. Yeah. But again, this is explicitly in the context of food for Simchas Yantiv, but even there, the way the Gemara got onto the blind person was when you shech the animal in the field and then bringing it in these poles. So even when we're allowing certain things for food, we want to be sensitive that it doesn't turn it into a market day. Okay, so you're right, but this presumably creates enough of a shino. You're right, it's treading a very thin line. Let's take a look now, top of Kaf Chad Amud Aleph, and look at the next mission, which continues this theme. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shokolad and Basar Keneged HaKlio Keneged HaKupis, that basically you're going again to the butcher, and you're going to pay him up after Yantiv. Nobody's talking about money, but you want to know how much meat you're getting from him. So besides the case of standing animals next to each other, he takes a steak, and he puts it on the scale. Now, he's not allowed to put a counterbalance, the formal weight on the scale opposite it, because that would really be like, transactionary and commercial. So what he could do, though, is he could put a hammer on it, or he could put, on another thing to create a balance. I'll give you a hammer's weight of steak or some type of other vessel. And then after Yantiv, you'll weigh the vessel that it was weighed against. Okay, but because it's not being weighed exactly 2.3 pounds, it's not as much as seen as a commercial transaction.
Do you know how much your hammer weighs exactly?
Yeah, I mean, if you've been using your hammer as your standard 2-pound weight, presumably not. The Chachamim no, you cannot look at the scale at all. You can't use the scale, even in this shinoi way. Even without exactly knowing right now the precise amount. Using the scale is much too much commercial. Okay, my kol ikar. What does it mean? Not at all. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Afilu l'shamar min achbarim. Not only can you not use it in an indirect way to weigh it, but let's say your scales are hung from the ceiling, and very high up, and you have a dog that's you're afraid is going to be eating the meat. You can't put it on the scales as a way of putting it like on a high shelf. You're not even interested in weighing it. Nope, even that you're not allowed any use of it. It's like a kli shemlachto le'isser, or worse. It's like a kli umnis, and it's completely off limits. Kli shemlachto le'isser wouldn't be a problem here, but anyway, it's completely off limits. It's completely using it in something that's set aside from commerce and transaction and is forbidden. Amar Ravidi Baravin, Luhu Detalia Bitarita. When that's a problem, it's only when it's hung from, Rashi says this is like the standard peg, we're talking about like a balance scale. The standard ring that you would hang it from when you would use it in its function as a balance scale. But if it's being like off of that ring and it's not in that context of that type of a function, then you could use it, again, not to weigh, but you could use it for some other purpose, like to keep it away from the dogs. Yes.
But is this, so this weighing is because it's commercial, but does it mean like, you're home skill, you want to see how much you weigh? It's not what you can
Maybe, that's true. I mean, there are other problems that, like Medida and Shabbos and whatever, and other types of things. But right, this particular problem here, where it's completely usher, it's because of the commercial context. The Amar Rav Yuna Mar Shmuel, Tabach uman asur lishko basar biyad. If you have an expert butcher, you can't even weigh it in the hand. Some people are so good, they've been doing it so long, they can just hold it like this and say, 2.3 pounds. Like, Rashi says that you're holding two things opposite one another. You're having one thing in one hand that, fixed amount of weight or something that you know how much, and you weigh the other thing and you say, these are weighed the same. But some people, I think, even just with one hand can just have a really good, accurate sense of how much it weighs. So that you can't do, even though you're not using a kli. This is all following the Chachamim against Rabbi Yehuda. So a shinoi doesn't matter. You can't do any real weighing. And if you know exactly how much it is, even without using a scale, then that's a problem. The Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, Tabach uman asur lishko basar b'mayim. Now that's even more obvious because Rashi says the water is water displacement. That you put it in water and the water gets displaced, and therefore you know exactly how much the volume is. Okay, so that to me is like more of a clear act of measuring, although normally you sell by weight, not by volume, than it is the case of using your hand. V'amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, asur lasos beis yad b'basar. What you cannot do now is basically you can't make a handle in the meat. So now they put stuff in a bag and you carry it home in the bag. But presumably, if you bought, a big side of beef, imagine you bought a side of beef. What I'll do for you is I'll cut out in the beef a hole in the side of the beef, and you'll put your hand through the hole and you'll carry the side of beef home, like through that handle. That you can't do, which is interesting because that's not about the commercial aspect. That's just about giving you an easy way of conveyance. But again, maybe by doing that, it makes it clear, like that it just makes it clear like you've gone to a store. That's like if the store wraps it all up and puts, makes it very, it's clear like when you're walking it home, it makes it's demonstrable that you bought it from a store. So, Amar Ravino ubiyada shari. But if you just want to make a hole through the side of the beef with your hand, not with a kli, and not in like a fancy professional way, that's allowed.
And people will see this.
People will see it, and it doesn't look so professional. It looks something like you've done yourself as a way of carrying it, presumably. Amar Rav Huna mutalaso siman bebasar. What you can do is also you can cut the meat in a particular way that it's clear that it's yours. It doesn't get confused with whose it is. And this also gets into concerns about meat that's left unattended, and meat that gets changed for other meat, and whole discussions in the Gemara. So kihad, right, and it's not like writing or like making something. Kihad the Rabbi Baravuna mechatich le'at plus karnasa. He basically cut it out the three corners. He made a triangle in his side of beef, and Rashi says he sent it home, and they would see that it was in triangle shape, and they know that it came from him.
Triangle K.
There you go. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon Rabbi shoklin mana keneged mana b'yom tov. So Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi. So this is going right at the transition period between the Tanaim and the Amoraim. They would weigh a mana against a mana on Yontiv, meaning that when they would be dividing meat between them, they'd have a side of beef that they purchased together. So they would basically, divide it and weigh. Okay, here, they wouldn't weigh it against some third thing that they knew its weight, but they put a side of beef on one side of the scale, and then they'd weigh the other side of the scale an equal amount, and then they'd say, you take half and I take half. So they didn't really know objectively how much it weighed, but they knew that each half weighed the same amount, and that they would do on Yontiv. So that's certainly not a mashkichim b'kaf maznaim kol ikar. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says like this: Kiman lo Reb Yehuda. Who's this going now? Not like Reb Yehuda, lo Rabbanan, not the Rabbanan. Ik Reb Yehuda amar shokolad and basar keneged klio keneged akupitz. Okay, you can use a vessel or you can use a hammer. Keneged hakukli in keneged midiach ridi lo. So they think that even Reb Yehuda wouldn't allow this case, because Reb Yehuda only allows you to put like a hammer on the other side of the scale, but to actually put something that's more normal to be on the scale, like meat, and to put meat on both sides of the scale, presumably that he wouldn't. Okay, even Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't allow that, which is surprising. You might think that you're not putting an objective weight, but even the Gemara assumes even he wouldn't allow it, because Rashi says this is derech hachokim. This is a normal way on a weekday that people would divide equally. If they own something in partnership, you would divide it equally by putting equal things on opposite sides of the scale. There's no shinui, Rashi says here, right? This is the basic way in which you would equally divide something that you owned in partnership, if you'd weigh them on equal sides of the scale. So even Rabbi Yehuda shouldn't allow it.
Isn't the kupitz the cleaver? It's a
knife, the
right?
cleaver, yeah. Okay, so even Rabbi Yehuda shouldn't allow it. Ikar Abanan, and if it's the rabbis, they don't let you use the scale for any purpose. So how could they do this? So Inu David Rabbi Yeshua, they do like Rabbi Yeshua. The time to the price Rabbi Yeshua Omer Shokli Mana Keneged Mana B'Yom Tov. You can divide up something that you own equally, and each person to get an equal portion, and you can do that on Yom Tov, presumably even using a scale. Amar Rav Yosef Halacha Rabbi Yeshua. We rule like Rabbi Yeshua. Hov it's not b'Bechoros Kivasei. Since we rule in Bechoros like him, we're not getting out of Bechoros. If not, we taught in the Mishnah Bechoros. Psulei HaMikdashim Hanasam LeHekdesh. Invalid sacrifices, the benefit goes to hektish, and you can weigh a mana against a mana by a bechor. What does that mean? So I mentioned this yesterday. I mentioned it again today. The bechor is unique. Actually, Meiser is like this in that you do not verbally instill the sanctity. Its sanctity comes from the fact that it was born as the first animal. Meiser from the fact that it was the 10th animal that walked out when you were counting the animals. And therefore, when it gets a blemish, you cannot redeem its value. You cannot transfer its kedusha because its kedusha wasn't instilled. It can't be removed. So that's on the one hand. You cannot be poded. On the other hand, because it still has kedusha and it can't be removed, the ironic halacha is that you can eat it with its blemish even without removing the kedusha, even without bringing it, as a korban. As a blemish, it can't be brought as a korban. So what you do is you eat it with the blemish without redeeming it. That's the halacha of bechor. A normal animal that gets sanctified, when it gets a blemish, can't be brought as a korban, but what you do is the same way you instill the sanctity, you can remove the sanctity and you redeem it. Now, that's halacha number one, and then you're allowed to eat it. But before you eat, even without redeeming. Now, what's the corollary is the following halacha. What do you do once you have redeemed, let's start with a korban, redeemed it had a blemish and you redeemed it. It doesn't become total chulin. For example, there are certain restrictions about what you're allowed to do with it, like shearing it and working it and so on. So there's some residual kedusha. Are you allowed to take this animal that was redeemed and once was korban and now has some residual kedusha and sell it in the marketplace and sell it like plain old meat? Hang it up, hang the flanks up in the marketplace, weigh it, and so on. So the halacha is, that might be seen disrespectful, but the halacha is you are allowed. And you know why you are allowed? Because if we let you sell it in the marketplace, you'll get the best price for it. Everybody is going there. If we allow you to weigh it and do all those types of things, you'll get the best. You'll be able to retail it and chop it up into pieces and get the best price. And if you're going to get the best price for it, that's going to have an impact on when you have to figure out how much is it worth when I redeem it. Well, how much is it worth now? I'm not going to redeem this value on something else. It's going to be how much money am I going to get for it when I sell it? So if we give you more latitude to sell it in a way that can get more for it, then that's going to mean that hektish is going to benefit because now you're going to redeem it. You're going to assess its value as worth more. So a normal kachim, which gets redeemed, in order that value should be the highest possible that you're redeeming it onto and going to use the proceeds for another korban, once it is redeemed, we allow you to sell it in the marketplace and to sell it like you would normally sell meat and to weigh it and so on. By a bechor, it's not being redeemed. So since a bechor is not being redeemed, if you want to sell your bechor with a mum, we're going to put more restrictions on you in order to be sensitive to the kedusha of the bechor. It's also that it has its full kedusha, right? It hasn't even had its kedusha removed. And therefore, a bechor, you're not allowed to sell in the shuk and in the marketplace, and you're not allowed to sell by weighing it, and you can only sort of wholesale it, but you can't retail it. That would not be respectful to the bechor. So that's what this Mishnah says. Let's read it. It says, Psulei mukdashim hanasam lehektish. Normal invalid sacrifices, the benefit goes to hektish, so we let you sell it in the marketplace and to weigh it.
You've redeemed it verbally already?
Yes, after you've redeemed it, you can sell it in the marketplace and so
Then you
on.
have to take that money
And
and
that-
to actually
Exactly.
if the redemption has been oral, has been verbal, gilui dat, as it
Right.
were, right? And then you take the money and you have to give
It's not just a gilui das, it's a verbal act.
verbal act.
Correct. Okay. That's by normal korbanot, and that's why you have restrictions on how you're going to sell it. But bechor, which the hektish doesn't benefit, you have limits about selling it in the marketplace. But even with those limits, shokli mana keneged mana bechor. What you are allowed to do, what we will let you do, is weigh equal weights by a bechor. That's not considered so much like like a bizayon and the normal way of selling things with the normal sense of like 2.3 pounds. You're just weighing things as having equal weights. So basically, what you see here is that, and this is Rabbi Yoshua, and this is the Mishnah that goes like Rabbi Yoshua. So that's Rabbi Yosef's claim that here, if we consider mana keneged mana not to be a form of commerce and transaction by a bechor, it won't be a form of commerce and transaction on Yantiv, and we'll let you do the same on Yantiv. That's Rabbi Yosef's claim. Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said back, maybe it's not a comparison. Adkan lo kama Rabbi Yoshua hacha. When Rabbi Yoshua allows you to weigh equal, mana keneged mana, use the scale to make equal weights. Ela deleka bizayin kachim. That's because the only concern is whether it's appropriate on Yantiv or not. How much is it commerce? But what he's not dealing with the sense of proper treating or improper treating of sanctified objects. There, maybe it's a more sensitive area. You have a bechor that's sanctified. Low, that would be it would be problematic. Maybe that would demand even less, even more restrictions. Inami, or say the opposite. The rabbis there that allow you to do mana keneged mana by before el mishum delo mechzik uvda dechol. That's because it's a question of are we disrespecting the sacrifices? Is it and therefore they say it's not so disrespectful. But the concern there, it's not a yantiv concern. It's not a concern that it looks like weekday activity. Here where it's weekday activity, low. It's not about meaning that they're two separate concerns. One of the criteria of concern is this weekday activity? The other concern is it disrespectful? And maybe the conclusions are different based on the different category. Okay. So the Gemara says l'meimra. Now that's the end. We don't know how we paskin in terms of mana keneged mana. Now the Gemara ends up by the following thing. L'meimra. Now this story was Reb Chia and Reb Shimon the son of Rabbi, so that they divided equally. So the Gemara says l'meimra the kapti adadi. Wait, this story seems to say that those two, Reb Chia and Reb Shimon bar Rabbi, were makbid on one another. Meaning, if they divided something, they wanted to make sure that everybody got exactly what was coming to them. The Hanu, but we know that they were so friendly, they didn't care about that type of stuff. The Hanu Shev Benisa, there was a case of 7 fish. The Asul Lebei Rebbe came to the house of Rebbe. Vishtaka Chamesh Minayu Bei Rebbe Chia, and somehow 5 of them wound up in the house of Rebbe Chia. So somehow Rebbe Chia helped himself to 5 of the 7 fish. Below copied Reb Shimon Rebbe, and Reb Shimon the son of Rebbe wasn't upset. Like, yeah, we're so friendly. What's mine is yours. You find some food in my house. You want to take it to yours. You don't even have to ask. Go ahead. So if that's true, why were they so makpi to divide their side of beef exactly equally? So Amarav Papa, Shadi Gavra Beinayu. Fine. So you have to change the story. You have to assume that there was some different person in the story. Rebbe Chia of Rebbe Shmuel. Either keep Rebbe Chia as the same, but the other person was not Rebbe Shimon Rebbe's son, but it was Rebbe Shmuel, Rebbe Yossi. Rebbe Shimon Rebbe, or if one of the people was Rebbe Shimon Rebbe, then the other person was Bar Kapara. So presumably, these are people we know that would get into business deals or were friends or might buy a side of beef together, but we also know that they'd be mocked that everybody got exactly what was coming to them. Okay. So anyway, the Gemara does not exactly conclude what is this case of mana keneged mana, but what it does reveal in comparing it to the case of the Bechor is this issue about different concerns. A concern of bizayin kachim, which therefore using weights and measures or whatever can lead to bizayin kachim. You're treating it just like a side of beef, but that's the question of how you're treating the object. The other is the question of uvda dechol. We don't care how the meat is being treated. We care about what it evokes in terms of a general type of commercial weekday activity. Yes.
With the Bechor, is it the Kohen who's selling it? As opposed
Yeah,
to
because that's right.
Kosher, which is the
owner, correct. You give your Bechor to the Kohen. He can't eat it until it gets a mum, unless there's a Beitzah mikdash, right? And then once it gets a mum, it's his property, but other people are allowed to eat it, so he can sell it to other people as well.
So there's a different dynamic also in terms of like with the sanctified animal. the sanctuary is getting the funds, so they would allow people. They would want to get.
That's my yes, but yes, that's the point I was saying. But they're not getting the proceeds from the sale. First, you transfer the kedusha, and then you go and you take the meat that's now left and you sell that in the marketplace. But the amount you assess, how much I'm going to assess the value, is based on what in the future I anticipate in terms of its sale.
Right, but I'm
Right.
just saying that, like, so the sanctuary might be willing to give more leniency because their interest,
yes.
whereas the individual Cohen is not so important.
Yes, that's exactly what it says. The difference of hanas and lehekdesh, exactly that. Yes, correct.
These days are like mocking the chilik of the horse.
Yeah. Or you sell the ear of the mother. Yes, but we're not going to worry about that. We'll do what we do b'chaz. Ein mashgicha. Next case. Ein mashchizin es a sakin b'yom tov. Going on to things you can do for food. We're leaving the commerce area, and now we're talking about not the actual preparation of the food, but what's called machshirei ochel nefesh, preparing the things that are necessary to enable you to prepare the food. Okay, so you cannot sharpen your knives on Yantiv. Avol masiya gabi chaverta. You can do one on top of the other. You know, you see on those chef shows that they do the two knives and they sharpen them by going them on one on top of the other. That you're allowed to do. That's a shino. Now, what's the problem here? So it might be uvda dechol. If you look at Rashi, 5 lines from the bottom, the last Rashi on the Mishnah, to mishani miderech chol. So that sounds like, he doesn't say it's a shinua, he says mishani miderech chol. Sounds like the problem is uvda dechol. Again, it's too commercial of an activity to be like sharpening the knife on the stone. I have to tell you about this. You know, the question about what constitutes uvda dechol is very hard to quantify. But I want to just make an interesting and ironic point, which is, so you basically have a fire on Yontiv, you can cook on Yontiv, you can transfer fire, but you know what you're not allowed to do? I mean, you look at any of these handbooks, you ask anybody in terms of what their understanding is, you can't use electricity. Right? So that I should be able to use my microwave on Yantav, or use my electric blender, or use my electric coffee machine, right? I mean, if I had to push a button, not. Why not? I mean, if I can do fire on Yantav, and I can do cooking, and I do these malachas, why can't I do electricity that's related to preparing food, right? So if you look at some of these books that try to explain it, they do these somersaults trying to justify why electricity is somehow an issue that isn't mutter because of tzarach ochel nefesh. But you know what it bottom line boils down to? Well, it boils down to uvda dechol, which is that when you start using electricity, it evokes a very different type of a, sort of world and experience, than when you're dealing with mechanical objects. And I really think that the assumption that you don't do electricity even on Yontiv, even in the use of food preparation, is ultimately rooted in these type of uvda dechol concerns. Because in terms of like a malacha or an isser d'rabbanan concern, it's hard to justify because that is allowed with tzarach ochel. So I think I say that because it's hard to understand what is all this uvda dechol. But the point is, but within giving you the latitude of allowing you to do malachas and allowing you to do certain drabanans, we don't want to turn it into a weekday experience. We don't want to turn Yontiv into the weekday. So certain types of activities do evoke much more that sense of it being like a weekday. So that's here this issue about that Rashi says about the sharpening of knives. Sharpening of knives on their whetstone would be too much of a weekday activity. Doing it like this informal way, not so. But we will see in the Gemara it might be more than uvda dechol. It might be an issue of tikkun maneh, of making a vessel, of if it was not usable, depending on how dull it had become, or it's Rashi in another place. Rashi says it looks like making a vessel, and then it becomes, well, then what's the big deal? Like, why can't you do malachas for the sake of ochel nefesh? So we will take a look, but there's different ways of understanding what the problem here is. So let's keep on going. So it says like this. Amar Ravuna, says Ravuna, Lo shanu ela b'mashchezet shel even. The problem is only a wet stone. Aval b'mashchezet shel eitz, if you're using a sharpening thing that's made out of wood, mutter, then that's not the normal way and that's permissible. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Hadamarta shel even aser lo amen elu lechadida. When you say you can't use the stone, even the prohibition of using the stone, that's only if the purpose is to sharpen it. Aval lahavir shamnuni is mutter, but to just get the shmutz off of it, that would be permissible. What? All right, they weren't worried. So anyway, so that's the most lenient. It's only forbidden with a stone and only when you're doing it intentionally to sharpen it. Michlal says the Gemara then applies to b'shel eitz afilu lechadida nami mutter, that if you're using wood, you can do it even intentionally to sharpen it. That's the most lenient read. Igademasni law asefa, but some read this discussion on the end and a more strict read. B'shel eitz mutter, it's permissible with wood. Amar Rav Yehuda Mishmuel hadamarta b'shel eitz mutter. When we say it's permissible with if it's against wood, lo amen el lahavi shamnu nisa. That's only if you're doing it to remove the shmutz. Aval chadada, to sharpen it, usher, it's forbidden. So that says not that you only you need two criteria to be forbidden: stone and sharpen. It's either criteria makes it forbidden, either stone or even with wood if it's intentionally being done for sharpening. So Gemara says michlal de b'shel even if it's stone, afilu lahavi shamnu nisa aser, even to just get rid of the shmutz, it's forbidden. Igad masni la masnisin. Some have this discussion about whether it's to sharpen or to remove the shmutz, not on the stone wood distinction, but on the Mishnah. You don't sharpen it on a whetstone. That's only to sharpen. But if it's to remove the shmutz, mutter, even on its standard whetstone. And that wouldn't. So then you need two criteria to be forbidden: the whetstone and the sharpening. So when it allows the issue about one knife against the other, the end of the Mishnah, even to sharpen it's permissible. Only when both those things are combined is it forbidden. And some say this distinction was put at the end of the Mishnah in a stricter read. You can run it against it's one knife against the other. When can you rub it against the other only to remove the shmutz? So you need two criteria to make it mutter, right? And therefore it'll be usher if it has any one problem, either sharpening or it's against the whetstone. Against the normal whetstone, even to remove the shmutz is forbidden. Okay. Who's now, so that's fine. That's the various criteria. But what is exactly the problem? I've mentioned to you Rashi that says uvda decho, but now we're going to look at the Gemara that says, that brings it into a different discussion. Let's take a look. Mantana de Mashchezes Asur, who's the author of the Mishnah that says that against a whetstone is forbidden? Amar Rav Chizda to look Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Yehuda. Titania, we turn in the Beitzah. Ein bein yontiv l'Shabbos ela ochel nefesh bilvad. So that's the Mishnah we know in Megillah. There's no difference between yontiv and Shabbos except things that are allowed for ochel nefesh. And the Beitzah adds, Rabbi Yehuda matir af machshirei ochel nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda allows even things that are done to prepare those things that you'll use in the food preparation. So basically, to make the knife, to prepare the knife, and sharpen the knife, for him, even that is allowed. So now the Gemara sounds like we're no longer talking about uvda decho, right? If it was an uvda decho, what does that have to do with this debate? Okay, it sounds like what we're talking about is that you're really doing a real malacha in sharpening the knife, or something that maybe is a derabanan malacha. Maybe Rashi says it looks like mitaken kli, or it's really mitaken kli. And do we allow malachas that are done not in the act of the food preparation itself, but in preparing things that will be used for the food preparation? And that is a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. So Amalei Rabbi Rav Chizda. So Rabbi said to Rav Chizda, Dashina mishimcha halach to Rabbi Yehuda. So he said, should we now say, since Rav Chizda pointed out the Mishnah wasn't Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi was inferring from that maybe that indicated that Rav Chizda goes like Rabbi Yehuda and wants to point out the Mishnah is not Divrei Hakol. So Rabbi said to Rav Chizda, should we now announce in your name that the halach is like Rabbi Yehuda? You can do machshirei ochel nefesh and yantiv. Amarle, so he said back to Rava, Yehi Rava dechol kihani mili mal yasa tidushun mishmai. May it be God's will that all wonderful things like this you should say in my name. Like, great, I love Rabbi Yehuda, and you should publicize it that I pass like Rabbi Yehuda. It's a great position. It's a big difference, right? What is the extent of what you're allowed to do for food purposes? I was standing in front of Rava. Now remember, Rava was the one that just asked Rav Chizda, and Rav Chizda told him we go like Rav Yehuda. So we go like Rav Yehuda, presumably you're allowed to sharpen knives on Yontif. So he said, I was standing by Rava, and he was sharpening his knife by the lip of a basket. Okay, now not on a whetstone. So you might say that works even according to the Mishnah. Anyway, the Amrile, and I said to him, are you doing it to sharpen it? Maybe it assumes like the more machmir position, that to sharpen it is a problem regardless. Okay? Oh, lahavir shamnunisa, or maybe you're doing it to remove the shmutz, which is allowed. The Amr Li, so clearly that assumes that even on a basket, it would only be allowed to remove the shmutz, like the more machmir way we read before. The Amr Li, and Rava said to me, lahavir shamnunisa, I'm just trying to remove the shmutz. That's what he said. But I saw that his real intent, I could infer from what he was doing, the lechaded kali. He really was sharpening it. It's sort of like that whole story with Shammai and Hillel, and he didn't want to admit why he was bringing the animal to the Beis Hamikdash, right? So he really paskined lakula, like Rabbi Yehuda, that you could do it even to sharpen it, okay? But he didn't want, but he was faking it. He didn't want to admit to me that's why he was doing it. Now, why? The kasavar, because he holds halacha the ein morin kain, that we rule like Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha in theory is like Rabbi Yehuda, that you can do things with tzorech ochel nefesh, but you don't go ahead and say that publicly. You don't paskin it publicly. Now, why do you not paskin it publicly? So this raises fascinating issues. The whole principle of halacha the ein morin kain, about sort of being like sort of a paternalistic approach that comes through psak, but also the responsibility that comes through psak. You tell people just straight what the halacha is, even if you know that they're going to wind up abusing it, or do you think that part of your responsibility as a rabbi is that people want to be doing the right things? So if that means sometimes not always giving them all of the facts, then you see that in these handbooks that they put out, where they have like a strict halacha up on top, and then they have the footnote in Hebrew, and it tells you like all the various leniencies. But it sort of is afraid that if people can't read the Hebrew, like it doesn't know if you can trust, the common person with all those leniencies because they'll abuse them. But I think if you can read and understand the Hebrew, then presumably you could be trusted. The only problem is it doesn't work in Israel, where they do the same thing with the footnotes, except people can read the Hebrew. So all you need to do is have the curiosity to read the footnotes. But anyway, this is a fascinating phenomenon of halacha ve'in morin kain. So what's the concern here? So Rashi says the concern is that even Reb Yehuda only allows it if it's EFshar lasos on Erev Yontiv. If you didn't have the option of doing it from Erev Yontiv. That when we come to actual food preparation itself, as we discussed earlier, that you're allowed to do even if you could have done it on Erev Yontiv. But even when we're talking about machshirei ochel nefesh, the things that are preparatory, that Reb Yehuda allows to be done, that would only be when you did not have an option of doing it Erev Yontiv. And that would be a big problem to tell people you could do machshirei ochel nefesh on Yontiv, because people will very easily slide from giving themselves latitude to do it when they didn't have an option to giving themselves the latitude to do it even when they did have an option. So that's why Rashi says we want to be careful how we share this information. Halacha ve'ein morin kain.
But what did you say before?
Okay.
You said before, everything nice you should say for my name.
Okay, so now Rava, however, but notice, by the way, he didn't give him a straight answer also, right? So maybe Rava inferred from the lack of the straight answer that there was a little bit of like not being completely forthcoming with this. Okay, so halacha ve'ein morin kain. The Amar Bai, now Bai said, I was standing in the presence of the master, which probably means Rabbah. And he was, sharpening his knife against the millstone. And I said to him, are you doing it to sharpen it or to remove the shmutz? And he said to me, I'm doing it to remove the shmutz. But I was able to infer that his real intent, he was doing it to sharpen it. And he's of the opinion, the halacha is like Reb Yehuda of machshirei ochel nefesh is allowed. The ein morin kain, and you don't rule that way. Okay. So therefore, and that becomes, by the way, I should say, do you remember the funny Gemara before about whether you're allowed to extinguish a fire for the sake of, to give like privacy to a couple so they could have sex on Yontiv? Remember that? And the Gemara says, are you allowed to extinguish the fire? And he says, well, go to a different room. Well, let's say you don't have a different room. Well, put up a mechitza. Well, let's say you can't put up a mechitza. Fine, it's usher. I was like, why are you giving me suggestions? Just tell me it's mutter or usher. So a number of Rishonim say that was a case, that issue was a case of machshirei ochel nefesh, not ochel nefesh, but if we include in the ochel nefesh category things that are like physical pleasure, that's shavel ochel nefesh, but that's only machshirim. That's not, that's sort of to remove some problem in order to allow, something that comes at a prior stage, not directly related to the actual creating of the experience itself. So therefore, and that was following the idea of halacha ve'in morin kain. So he didn't want to give him a straight answer. He couldn't say, I can't say it's mutter, ain't morinke. So I can try to do this, try to do that. And when he was forced into a corner and he didn't have an option, he said, fine, you're forcing me to give an answer. I'll tell you it's also. But anyway, but a number of Rishonim, right, but a number of Rishonim say that actually it technically was mutter, but he was not going to come out and say it because of halacha ve'in morinke. And that becomes fascinating. What is the actual psak halacha of machshirei ochel nefesh? And according to many, the psak halacha is halacha ve'in morinke, which is an interesting psak halacha.
So we'll forget this conversation, right?
Exactly. Okay, V'amar Abaye. So Abaye said, I'm sorry, we just did that. Okay, Ibailu, they asked the question. Mahu laharot sakin lechacham b'yom tov. Now, can you show the knife to a chacham on Yom Tov, sort of like showing the bechor to a chacham, right? Is that sort of like an uvd? Rashi says the concern is like an uvda dechol, because butchers, even to this day, there's often there's things like when you become, butcher shows the knife to the rabbi of the city. I mean, you don't have rabbis of cities anymore, but anyway, that sort of gets, it's sort of like giving the imprimatur of the rabbi, and so to acknowledge that this person is able to shecht. But anyway, an act of inspecting the knife. So the concern Rashi here said would be a similar uvda dechol. The butcher showing the knife to the rabbi is the type of thing you do when you're about to go and shecht meat in a normal weekday activity. So are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? Rav Mari Braid Rav Bizna Shari. He said it was permissible. Rabbanan Asiri, and the rabbi said it was forbidden. Rav Yosef Amar Talmid Chacham Ro'la Atmu Machil Lacherim. That I can check my own knife if I'm a Talmid Chacham and I know how to inspect the knife. And once I've seen that my knife is good and I've done that in private, it hasn't been some interaction with other people and in a public scenario which could lead to uvda dechol. I've in private inspecting my own knife. Then I could say to somebody who wants to shecht, here, you can borrow my knife. All right. Now, if a knife is dulled, you can sharpen it on Yom Tov. That's if it's still somewhat able to be used, like you can still cut something by putting pressure, it's just dull, it's not sharp. But if it's really not usable, that's forbidden. And this seems to be a distinction. If it's dull and you're sharpening it, that might just be an uvda dechol issue. If it actually can't cut at all, and you are now sharpening it to make it cut, that might be a real malacha of tikkun mana, of making a kli, of like makeh b'patish. And then that gets back to the issue of, are you allowed to do, machshirei ochel nefesh on Yom Tov or not? 1 minute, let's read a little more. Darash Rav Chisda v'temer Rav Yosef echad sakin shenifkama ve'echad shvut shenirtzam. Whether it's a knife that has a nick, which is considered to be worse than just dull, or whether it's a spit that the top, that basically, like Rashi says, the tip of it has broken off. Ve'echad greifas tanur v'kirayim, or sweeping out an oven. B'yom tov banu machok rebut of rabbanan. Those would be real malachas. It would really be making a kli, and that would be the debate of rebut and the rabbis of machshirei ochel nefesh. Now, sweeping out the oven is unclear. What tikkun kli is it? Rashi says some of the plaster fell down, and you're sort of fixing some of it inside. You're not just sweeping out the ashes. Okay, so what's that debate? So again, we introduce it to Tanya, we turn a Beitzah. Ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbos el ochel nefesh bavad. Reb Yehuda matir af machshirei ochel nefesh. My time into Tanakama. What's the reasoning of Tanakama that you're not allowed to do things that are at a preparatory stage? Amar Kra, the verse says, "Hu levado yeyaseh lechem." It alone, things that are done asher yeyachel ochel nefesh, can be done. Who? Only things that are directly about food preparation, v'lo machshirav, not things that are preparatory. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Kra, Rabbi Yehuda said, Amar Kra, the verse says, lachem, yes, lachem, for you. L'chol tzarcheichem, any need. So this is part of your needs, because you need this in order to enable you to have food. V'tanakama haksiv lachem. So what does the Tanakama do with lachem? That seems to give you more latitude. Amar l'cha, hu lachem v'lo l'nochrim. For you, but not for non-Jews, something we've seen before. V'idach nami haksiv hu. And what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the fact that it says hu, which is a limiting word? Amar l'cha, ksiv hu, ksiv lachem. You're right, it says hu, which is limiting, and it says lachem, which is more inclusive. Lo kasha, and this is what I was saying earlier. Kan b'machshir she'efshar lasos ha'mer of yantav, kan b'machshir she'efshar lasos ha'mer of yantav. Could you have done it before yantav or not? Now that's funny, because normally that type of issue, you could have done it earlier, sounds like a rabbinic concern, right? We won't let you do it if you could have done it earlier. But here he sounds like it's a real biblical issue. Machshirin that you could have done before yantav is actually biblically forbidden.
From
But if you
Pasuk.
could not have done it before Yantiv, and Rashi says, what's not have done it? So it doesn't just mean the problem cropped up on Yantiv. Rashi says, let's say you were just too busy on Erev Yantiv. It's funny that though, it becomes part of what actually allows you to do a malacha on Yantiv if you did not have that option. Okay, and let's just read one more line. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shvud shenirtzaf asur l'takno b'Yom Tov. If the spit bent, you can't use it on Yom Tov. So Rashi says presumably it's usable, but not so convenient. So pshita, obviously maybe because you could anyway use it. Lo tzricha de'avagav de'mishir b'yadei. Even though you could straighten it with your hands, and maybe it's not a big fix, nevertheless it's still being fixing it. And that would be a type of a thing that would be forbidden. Okay, so now we'll pick up with this tomorrow, but the question that we're left with is, why are we saying that these things are forbidden if we just pass like Rabbi Yehuda about machshirim, that's efshar lasosa me'erev yantiv, right? Or efshar lasosa me'erev yantiv. Is this following the idea of, halacha ve'in mori kain, that we don't want to straight out rule like Rabbi Yehuda? Or is it possible that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who allows you to do machshirin, he might limit it, and maybe really making a new vessel might be something that even he wouldn't allow. And I will let you think about that, and we'll pick up with this tomorrow.
Does this seem like this is the primary location for that, Mr.